Okay, so here's our removal of the carbon dioxide we left off on. So here's the movement through the blood, right? We'd have moving on the way, right, getting to the lungs. Here's our situation with the blood cell and the plasma and the alveoli. So lungs will remove carbon dioxide from the body. Reverse of the reactions due to pressure gradients. Okay, so we have to have more carbon dioxide and would here in the pulmonary capillaries than we did in the alveoli. And so this would shift this bicarbonate back in and the chloride out. It would combine with the hydrogen ions released from the hemoglobin, producing carbonic acid, which would then become water and carbon dioxide, both of them being exhaled. And then carbon dioxide attached to the hemoglobin would be released, and carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma would move as well. So everything reverses. We move carbon dioxide into the alveoli, and we're going to exhale this. All right. So again, modifications for our function. So changes for the purpose of function. Hypernia, which is increase, right? Increase more, and this P and E is a prefix related to breathing, right? Like in pneumonia. So hypernia is in like apnea. So apnea is a cessation of breathing. Hypernia is increased rate and depth as an exercise or disease to meet an increase in oxygen demands. All right. And I have mentioned this before that exercise, there's a lot of input to the respiratory center, involving so many different sensors that prepare us for this need of oxygen. Hyperventilation is increased ventilation unrelated to the oxygen needs. Okay, so differentiate the two, and leads to low amounts of carbon dioxide and therefore a high pH in the blood. Excuse me. High altitudes, right? So I've mentioned this in some of the previous videos that while oxygen is still a certain percentage of the atmosphere, there is a decrease in the total pressure. So 760 here, maybe 720, a mile or so up, which mountains like Denver, Mexico City, which means there's a decrease in the partial pressures of oxygen, and that's a problem. Since partial pressure dictates the oxygen loading, so at rest you're probably going to have to be delivering the same number of oxygen molecules, but when you become active, you do not have the reserves of oxygen. Okay, so you've given it up. Right? So you could meet your needs when you weren't very active at a higher altitude, but once you become active, well, you'd already used your reserves, so you experience an altitude sickness. All right. Its symptoms are generally you become nauseated and lightheaded, drowsy, and the pulse rate, because you're going to move more blood faster, right? That's why we increase pulse to try to compensate. The solution is you acclimate through increased production of red blood cells, because more red blood cells means more ability to carry oxygen, which you have less available to you, but you have more carriers, then you can solve your problem. All right. The development of the respiratory system occurs, and we have a whole, we talk about this more at the end of the course as well, just development in general. But here you have the situation again. You're developing early on. You just don't finalize these lungs until very late in development, as we say here. And that's because you're not going to need to use these lungs until after you're born, right? Your oxygen is dissolved and carried in hemoglobin of mom, and that is transferred to fetal hemoglobin. You make your own hemoglobin, has a better ability to bind oxygen and suit your needs. So you don't ever have to use lungs to ventilate until you're born. Say most of the development comes from the endoderm. We'll talk about this again at length later on in the course, but this is an inner layer. That's what the end refers to. And we form these structures. They bud and elongate and bifurcate and just crazy amount of branching and branching. So about fourth week of development while you're an embryo, and then your embryonic development ends about week 8. So here's where you are at the end of the embryonic. So you actually have things in place, but it's not working. And then about week 16, so a couple months later, the respiratory bronchioles form, and you may begin some breathing movements, but you're not really moving, right, air. You're just practicing, if you will. And then week 27 to 28, enough alveoli to breathe, and surfactant is starting to be made. So that's why your survival becomes infinitely more likely around this time, because you would be able to take in air if you were born, and that's really, really important. So before birth, the lungs are actually filled with amniotic fluid. This is a fluid you are surrounded by, and of course it moves in and out. Mucus and surfactant, and this is squeezed out in the vagina and absorbed, right? So it's going to be absorbed by the rest of the body, or leaved or expelled. And the neonate will inhale and inflate the alveoli for the first time. All right? And that pretty much finally gets us through this chapter. I hope that if you have any questions, please feel free to bring them to class, email them, and that this is a pretty clear understanding of the process of respiration.